The Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. The latter stages of the 20th century would change the tobacco industry for years to come. In the 1990s, the tide shifted for big tobacco companies in the United States. Arguments were becoming more and more involved, and state governments became furious with major tobacco companies. Tobacco has had its effects on state governments ever since its seeds were first planted in an attempt for a profit. What the early tobacco founders never pictured was 46 states and officials backed by the federal government all coming together to work against the modern-day tobacco companies. The events that took place from the early 90s into the 2000s changed the tobacco industry tremendously. The largest civil litigation settlement in U.S. history was put into place to avoid bankruptcy in the tobacco industry. Despite the controversy between the big tobacco companies of the United States and the U.S. government, the economic struggles and outcomes, as well as the ensuing legislation in federal court, both contributed to the compromise known as the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. The MSA's basic elements consist of state claims against the participating manufacturers in exchange for the manufacturers agreeing on the following topics. Primarily, to pay the states annually and in perpetuity billions of dollars. Next, to permanently stop their advertising, promotion, and marketing of cigarettes. And thirdly, to contribute $1.5 billion to establish what has become the American Legacy Foundation, an entity dedicated to counter-advertising and public education against cigarette smoking. In an overview, the Master Settlement Agreement set up a national government and tobacco cartel that harmed consumers and small businesses by increasing cigarette prices and restricting competition. Before any legislation began regarding this case, cigarettes and other forms of tobacco were silently harming and killing many innocent people. Many cases were reported by many different sources that almost every state had reports of cigarette-related illnesses and deaths. Tobacco was no longer prevailing, and in the 1990s, the MSA case began as several states sued the major cigarette manufacturers including Philip Morris USA, R.J. Reynolds, Brown & Williamson, and Lorillard to recover Medicaid and other costs that states incurred in treating sick and dying cigarette smokers. The prices of healthcare were rising in the late 20th century, and with all the instances where smoking caused harm to people, the prices of aid were getting too much, so the government and the people were both enraged. The biggest organization working against the tobacco companies was the NAAG, National Association of the Attorney General. But of course, other states wanted their share, so they worked right into the mix and caused even more problems. The economic status of tobacco companies in the U.S. were decreasing. It was not just the success of tobacco companies that was decreasing, but state bonds began to meet their match as well. But of course, more conflicts were on the rise. One company that surely did not help the cause was Hill & Knowlton. Hill & Knowlton is a global public relations consulting company that worked alongside the tobacco companies. Then owner and CEO John Hill claimed to seek an advantage by inferring that his products were less risky than others. While all other major tobacco companies were under severe fire, Hill himself was accused of 97 accounts of bank fraud. In total, the companies took excessive fire from an overwhelming 116 accounts of bank fraud. The economic problems were not over yet. They followed even after initial agreements. As any large business knew at the time, money was everything. The four major companies began with high stock, yet from 1998 to 2004, Philip Morris International, the largest tobacco company at the time, hit an all-time low. Each one of their shares dropped to under $40, where the normal is around $100. This clearly exemplifies the economical struggles that these companies had to face. As they were under fire and their stocks were dropping, state governments pushed harder and harder in the MSA battle. To polish off every economic problem in the United States, including the tobacco issues, the U.S. economy was heading in a bad direction as the dot-com bubble burst and the stock markets dropped rapidly. The severe drop in the stock market would not help the tobacco companies in their quest to avoid being fired upon by their opposers. After the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, the MSA, was put into effect, after all the legislation, the major cigarette companies and others were hit hard with many penalties and had many of their privileges taken away. Owners of tobacco farms also were under some fire. They now must hold a valid source of ID and be cleared by state officials, maybe even federal officials, to be able to maintain their farms just like before. Tobacco companies, as a result of the MSA, lost many of their advertising abilities. The companies lost tremendous amounts of money because of this section in the compromise between the people and the companies. Philip Morris USA, The top-selling tobacco company thrived off of their cartoons in magazines and newspapers around the country. However, due to the MSA, they could no longer produce any source of publicity that refers to their cigarettes. This decision was made after a study suggested that nearly 400,000 teens started smoking each year due to what they see in advertisements. One state that went against the MSA and the advertising limitations was Massachusetts. Cigarette marketing to teens actually increased through magazine advertising. Once it was figured out, the public and the government officials attacked the tobacco companies to immediately change this. The big takeaway from the tobacco companies was their ability to sponsor concerts or athletic events. To go along with that, no team or stadium could use any form of tobacco name as a sponsor. The final ruling of the court that had an impressive impact on the companies was related to the actual cigarettes themselves. Louisiana State Court ruled that the number of cigarettes per pack is 20 minimum. Economically, this part of the MSA positively and negatively impacted the economics of tobacco companies because they will make more money when they sell it, but the companies will have to spend more money to make the cigarettes. All of the above court rulings from the MSA took their toll on the cigarette companies. The rulings were clearly in favor of the state governments as they took away certain aspects that cigarette companies thrived off of. Economically, this displays how tobacco companies took a hit and suffered from this. Losing their advertising privileges and sponsorships, companies panicked because they needed money to keep their numbers and popularity booming in a time of disaster for them. In an email from Philip Morris USA, the company answered 2 questions regarding the Master Settlement Agreement. To much of a surprise, the company was very open to every and all questions offered. For the questions asked and answered. First, in the grand scheme of the MSA, your company has been written up as a major contributor in the ongoing legislation between the states and many tobacco companies. I am writing today to get the Philip Morris side of the whole conflict and understand how your company was violated throughout the lengthy process. Answer. Philip Morris USA and International is a cooperation that thrives off of its success. The process regarding the Master Settlement Agreement was a very complicated and involving trial. Obviously, our company was targeted by the 46 states involved and could not fight to win our case. However, here at Philip Morris USA, we see the Master Settlement Agreement, MSA, as a positive that created challenges for our corporate staff. At the conclusion of the whole process, our company took an excessively large economic hit, as well as the other big tobacco companies involved. To this day, payments are still being shipped out to the states, as the MSA states that the payments are indefinite. What Philip Morris USA is explaining is that their company used the restrictions set in place from the MSA as a way to boost their productivity. Also mentioned and notable, the company, along with the others affected, is still dishing money and funds to all 46 states. That money by now, 2018, must reach billions and billions since they have been forced to pay all state governments and health providers. Second, how do the people of Philip Morris USA, both past and present, feel towards the outcome of the MSA? Answer. Although this question cannot be answered in completion due to company policies, here at Philip Morris USA and International, we have an optimistic feeling towards the MSA. As said before, the MSA provided the company with new opportunities needed to seek improvements in our business structure. The legislation process that resulted in the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement was a long process including private lawsuits mixed with state and federal enforcement. In total, the national settlement was the largest of any case in the history of federal law, reaching heights at $368.5 billion. Mississippi's Attorney General exclaimed after the MSA was finalized that the states came together and defeated the beasts being the tobacco companies. The compromise of the entire situation was officially in pen and paper. Signed off by the Louisiana State Court and federal authorities, the MSA was in effect. A journalist on the case wrote about the reactions of the many CEOs coming out of the courthouse, blank-faced, pale, and not happy. It was clear that the states and the U.S. government had defeated the big tobacco companies with the compromise known as the MSA. As for the future, tobacco companies indefinitely will lose their funding and remain paying the states in perpetuity. This huge loss in capital could only be fixed by one change in the future: growth in the productivity and production of Philip Morris USA and all the other tobacco companies involved. In present-day 2018, many researchers have proven that tobacco usage has gone down due to many different causes. Advancements in technology and companies such as the Juul and Juno have swept over the nation with their electronic form of nicotine. The light at the end of the tunnel for tobacco companies began to dampen because of their consequences from the MSA and technological advances that soon would hit every news station in America.